So start off with very, very broad discussion of the difference between history and history as it informs architectural design. Okay? There's history of very many kinds. There's social history, economic history, cultural history. There's history of architecture, history of art, history of painting, history of drawing. There are histories galore in relationship to the study of the objects and subjects of the past. Then there is the question of what you do with this extraordinary ramified past in relationship to present design and in, quote unquote, the studio. I was educated at a moment where history was extremely present in the studio and extremely present in courses, very serious courses on the Renaissance, on the Gothic, on antiquity. But where that history and the history in the studio was what I would call completely abstract. It was to do with the question of the facade, the question of the entry, the question of spatial organization and ritual and so on. So you could extract, or you were asked to extract from your experience of historical objects, of historical environments, of historical urban and rural environments, extract those principles of organization, right, which you could then begin to deform and reform. There was also a particular kind of history taught by Colin Rowe, which was a history that said, if you look at something, abstract it from something, abstract it, diagram it, reorganize it, and then at some point in your reorganization, you will be signaling the sense of your project by a kind of implicit abstract reference to another project in the past. Yeah.
In a few weeks, we're going to be sitting in on a different lecture by Harry Cobb, and he will tell us that history was all but absent under Gropius's Harvard.
Right.
And I wonder if you could just situate yourself within that timeline, because he makes a claim that much of his discovery of history as a phenomena is a result of a kind of retaliation against his own education. And I was interested by his introduction and the sort of absence of history, or absence of history in the way that it's used as an alibi, which was all what my education was about because of that burning postmodern moment. And so I'm very conscious of the kind of ebb and flows of the presence of history and how it's instrumentalized. And I'm just wondering where you and Harry fit in that constellation.
Well, I'm a little younger than Harry. So I fit as a kind of...
I'm trying to show how that cycle goes up and down.
And I've tried to avoid dates because, I'm always told...
Locations?
My dear wife always tells me, stop dating yourself. People will think you're old. Anyway, yes. The ebb and flow, of course, emerges at the beginning of the 20th century when there is a strong reaction from social sciences, Max Weber, from psychology and sociology, Zimmel, from the academization of art and architectural history, Werthlin and company. There's a strong reaction to the notion of continuously copying styles, continuously styling the past and imitating the styles of the past. At that moment, that reaction is a very, very difficult reaction because the Beaux-Arts educational system, which covers Europe in most degrees in terms of both in England and in France and in Germany, there is a sense that you cannot throw away the past. And the struggle of modernists like Corbusier and Mies and others to respect history on the one hand, abstract history on the other, and internalize their history in the objects that they make led to a kind of oversimplification of abstraction, I think, especially in the States after the Second World War, and especially in the Bauhaus itself under Gropius. What is interesting about the Gropius question is that there was never, until Gropius left the Bauhaus, an architecture studio in the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus did not teach architecture.
Yeah.
It taught everything but architecture, which meant that Gropius could remain the king, right? I mean, he was the only architect, he was the architect. Everything else would build the cathedral of which he was the master, right? But there was no history in the Bauhaus, and there was no architecture in the Bauhaus. Architecture came in the Bauhaus with Hannes Meyer and then Mies, but very, very briefly. When Gropius came to Harvard, he had a tremendously contentious relationship with the dean. He came as the chair of architecture. The dean of architecture was Joseph Hudnut, and Hudnut was a great believer in history. In fact, Hudnut was a sponsor of an emigre architectural historian, Emil Kaufmann, and even when Emil Kaufmann died prematurely, provided the money personally for the publication of his posthumous book on Enlightenment architecture. So Hudnut was very, very interested in architectural history, was very interested in getting Siegfried Giedion to the School of Architecture, which Gropius absolutely refused. He refused. He thought Giedion was an absolute imposter who basically was a Corbusier fan, was nothing but Corbusier. The German tradition was nothing for Giedion. Space-time and architecture, in fact, has one small photograph of Mies and nothing of Gropius. So in the end, Hudnut had to get Giedion invited by the Norton-Simon committee. So he gave the Norton-Simon lectures outside the architecture school, which became space-time and architecture. So.
But then this asks the next question: was Gropius ignorant, or was he much more devious than that? Was he recasting history into a new frame that suited his narrative?
I think he was not recasting history. I think he was total believer in the science of functionalism that would, with the tools of industrialization, emerge with a new architecture without history, a new architecture for the modern age. I really think he believed that.
But that did not reflect his own education, which presumably had a...
Well, he started off as a neoclassicist.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right?
So he himself was rejecting the father, so to speak, by a kind of strict neoclassicism. I just wanted to these are the kind of monsters that we had to deal with in school. Siegfried Giedion, Space-Time and Architecture, that was the history. Peter Eisenman, who was a TA in Cambridge. When I arrived in Cambridge, he arrived at the same time. He was a TA PhD student. I was an undergraduate the first year. He gave us Space-Time and Architecture as the history book to read, right? It took Colin Rowe to tell me, put that away. It's nonsense. Henry Russell Hitchcock gave the lectures at Cambridge on Frank Lloyd Wright, interminably boring lectures on Frank Lloyd Wright. And then there was that group, the Nicholas Pevsner, who had come to Britain with Vic Cover. Pevsner as the head of the Architectural Review, editor of the Architectural Review, and a lecturer in London University, Vic Cover at London University before he came to Columbia, and then the very puzzled Colin Rowe, who really doesn't know what to do with either of them, but who was a student of Vic Cover, plagiarized and took over Vic Cover's work on Palladio and turned it into, without footnotes, a masterwork on Palladio and Le Corbusier. Acting as a younger generation, there were these three. There was Rainer Banham, who was not trained as an architectural historian, but as a technical repairman for aircraft during the war, then studied under Pevsner and did his thesis, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, which was published in 1960-61. and was the Bible for the history of modern architecture after Pevsner. Leonardo Benovolo, who was a center-right Catholic historian who was one of the few to start to describe the history of modernism as a social and political movement. Bruno Zevi, who led a revolt against Gropius when he was exiled in the Harvard School in 1943, and calling for more history, in fact, and became the resident historian of the Christian democratic right in Italy. History as the history of technology, history as the history of society, history as the history of space. So each of those histories was also very guided towards a project in architecture. In other words, Banham wanted archigram, Benevolo wanted social housing, Zevi wanted Frank Lloyd Wright. And the image of a social democratic architect, right? History, why is history important? We get it from the very source, from Vitruvius. Vitruvius says you can't explain your work unless you know history. So you gotta know history. Or even more important for the modern age, this quotation, which is well known to all of you. To be sure, we need history, but we need it in a manner different from the ways in which the spoilt idler in the garden of knowledge uses it, no matter how elegantly he may look down on our coarse and graceless needs and distresses. That is, we need it for life and action, not for comfortable turning away from life and action, or merely for glossing over the egotistical life and cowardly bad act. We wish to use history only insofar as it serves living. In three respects, history belongs to the living person. It belongs to him as an active and striving person. It belongs to him as a person who preserves and admires history. It belongs to him as a suffering person in need of emancipation. This trinity of relationships corresponds to a trinity of methods for history, to the extent that one may make the distinctions monumental method, an antiquarian method, and a critical method. Monumental method would be that method of using history which serves to make history the act of power, the act of monumentalization, the act of reinstating something which was lost. Antiquarian history is something that looks at history completely divorced from the present and is absorbed in the study of the past for the past's sake, right? Critical history is something that does things with history. Here's the two people who did justice in their work to the Parthenon, both in the Parthenon. Here's Le Corbusier in a very difficult moment of trying to absorb himself within the stones of the Parthenon column, and Aldo Rossi trying to be as tall as the Doric column. Neither quite worked, but both of them took the notion of history very, very powerfully and tried to absorb it within their work. I would say that one of the earliest critical historians, the architects were always their own historians, but one of the first critical historians was Zabruste, who realized that architecture no longer had any power, no longer had the power that it had in the church or the castle, but only the power to shelter an increasingly democratic nation, an increasingly democratic state, the library. It had the power of knowledge. His ghost was Plato's Academy, the residues of which were found in Athens and were also pictured in Raphael's School of Athens. And you can see that ghosting in steel the structure of the academy was the way in which Labrousse looked to the past. Or where someone like Schinkel will look to the past by taking the Pantheon for the most highest artistic works of sculpture in his Altus Museum, take the Greek Stoa as the intimation that his museum is no longer a temple but also open to the people in the agora, and the very wittily taking the plan of the palace, the king's palace, which the Altes Museum stands opposite, and wrapping the whole thing round as a linear sense of history in action as you go from room to room. Come the 1970s and 1980s, you have Jim Sterling building in post-war Germany, the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, taking literally the plan of the Altes Museum, stripping the Stoa from the front, stripping the dome from the Pantheon, wrapping around with a chronological sense, but actually making the whole thing a powerful urban route from the top of the hill, skateboarding around that wonderful skateboard run through to the other side, through to Stuttgart in the center. So that's a way of using history which is quite literal, diagrammatically. Another way of using history will be Aldo Rossi, who passed this little palace with its unfinished facade in Venice every morning on the way to the Institute for Architectural History, seeing this column, which apparently, according to Tafuri, was built by Filarete, and building it into his Berlin operations. So against this history was this history, the history we know, the history of the relationship tattered at the end between Colin Rowe and the young Peter Eisenman. This is Peter Eisenman in 1963. You might not recognize him. But from Colin Rowe, Peter Eisenman gets diagrammatic history from Frankel and from Vekova, the diagrams of Palladio that Peter has been fighting with ever since he met Colin Rowe. The notion of the Palladian plan being completely subsumed by the movements and structure of the modern plan, and then his thesis, 1963, where all history is absorbed into a diagrammatic vision of planes and the structure of cubes and primary forms, to the point where in that wonderful thesis, you have the Corbusier Armée du Salut with its very contorted entrance, now analyzed by Eisenman. There's the plan. You know the plan. You come up, you go across the bridge, you go into the circle. Sorry, you go into the circle. You come into the square. You turn and you move to the elevators. A trick, according to Peter, that allows you to do that as opposed to come up the hill and go like that, and without any kind of preparation. And so here's Peter diagramming, perfectly nice. You come in the entrance, you have the axes, there you have the diagonal of the cross axis. That creates a problem, so you have to do a right-hand bend into the cylinder and then into the thing. But then all kinds of complications at that little pavilion, where you have to do several right-hand bends backwards and forwards until you finally collapse into the cylinder. And once you get into the cylinder, there's a huge explosion of arrows around you, to the point where you are completely discomfited, and that you are smoothed on one side and cultured on the other side, and pushed and pressed on the other side, until you get into this, exhausted with all these arrows and lines, into this particular space. And then you come into the square space, which gives you another centralized thing. So from this kind of contortion to this kind of contortion to this kind of contortion, you're ready finally to enter. So that's one kind of history, right? And that's the final kind of history I want to talk about, is Manfredo's history, which wants to dissociate itself from all this programmatic operation of how you use history from design. You want to actually remove yourself and study the way in which, as he says here, rather than turning the past as a sort of fertile ground, rich in abandoned mines to be successively rediscovered, finding in them anticipations of modern problems, we must get used to seeing history as a continuous contestation of the present. The way for architecture is not to retreat into the night of pure form, he's talking about Peter, relating only to itself, As an instrument of design, history is sterile. It can only offer solutions and implications already taken for granted. A new solution implies a jump, a radical reshuffle of the problem, a risky adventure. History can only prepare the basis for this adventure and explain why it is not feasible for today. That's the image I gave of kind of the Baroque perspectival telescope, which of course is imminent in Borromini's stair in the Barberini Palace. You notice in the second state the gallows appears. Tafuri has an extraordinary analysis of this in The Sphere in the Labyrinth, but also points to the fertile nature of this image, which is completely uninterpretable at base. For example, Eisenstein, who used the cartoury as a series of decompositions that allowed him to have a theory of montage in film. That theory of montage in film giving Schumi a notion of the relationship between movements and architecture, and the whole Baroque image of telescoping perspectives, giving, of course, Gordon Mather Clark the possibility of developing Baroque office in one of his last cuttings. Not using history, but understanding history. So that would be where I am. And of course, then Aldo decides to indict Manfredo for assassinating architecture by historicizing it. So,
thank you.
Sir.
I think I have to.
Read into that.
I think so. Let me see. And then I was born. The majority of what I will present is actually student work and a reflection of the predicaments of a student trying to come to grips with the presence of history in a very confused time, I would say. Contrary to Michael's introduction, I was at the tail end of a moment in which the presence of history in its challenge to the orthodoxies and the positivisms of modernism had fully bloomed, to the point that history was being used as a crutch, as an alibi, that if history was there, or if recognizable forms were there, then it must be right. But without a kind of critical interface that you're bringing to Tafuri. So our first year in architecture was the end of that. And yet our education was absolutely saturated with that aura, let's say. Then came the emergence of theory in the new guys. Theory in our context through the voice of people like Michael Hayes, Judith Wallen, who was a student of Colin Rowe, and Rodolfo Machado, some of whom had drawn from French structuralism, and others who are trying to grapple with post-structuralism and the ways in which it re-envisions our relationship to language and criticism. But much of our fascination lay in the predicaments of history and the ways in which buildings and their spaces are the evidence of conflicting cultures, manifest as sometimes irreconcilable artifacts that are transported, are fictitious, and the result of a form of instrumental madness. And so we were very conscious about the artifice of history and the way it could be deployed, as much as it was a topic of scholarship. Much of this talk is also about my journeys to Rome, having decided to go to Rome at an age a little bit too early to understand either history or Rome itself. I found myself in a context replete with archaeology and history without an ability to decode it. And during my stay in Rome in 1983, I came across a domus which had 6 entries for follies in them. In fact, Diana Agrest was one of those. But this is another one I discovered by Machado and Silvetti, one of whom was a professor at RISD. And I said, how curious. Look at them. Why would they be building Roman architecture in this day and age? And I was somehow, it was very recognizable, but I could not recognize the figure that is somehow encrypted in these various facets. It was only upon third and fourth look that I began to understand that figure. But for those of you who can appreciate the presence of history, you also know that the orders of brick and their treatments have a mechanical or structural function. They have an order to them in the way that they either bear loads or retain earth and have a relationship with performance. So it was a kind of moment of awe that I realized that this entire structural and configurational edifice of their work was actually a ploy to get to the kind of the figure of the monster, the cranium that is depressed in this earth and somehow evocative of some other iconographic or symbolic gesture that they were after in discovering the folly. So the configurative discovery came also at a moment early in my career when everybody asked, well, what do you bring from your culture to architecture? Born in London, raised in Pakistan, in South Africa, and very few years in Iran, subsequently in the United States, and then to Italy, I had little to show of Iranian knowledge. And so in college, at your age, I ventured into the library to understand more of how brick actually has historically operated. And so here's what I discovered as a kind of generational shift of knowledge that was transmitted through crafts, not architecture in the way that we think of it today. It was never theorized. It was somehow passed through trades from the Seljuk period to the Safavid period and then finally to the Qajar period. This is happening over 400 plus years. And as you look at the section of the wall, they're all virtually the same until you begin to recognize that the kind of iconography that is embedded in the Seljuk wall is actually integral to its structure. That same order of patterning that is embedded in the Safavid wall is structural and yet independent of the structural wall. It's tied to it, but not really, and therefore can change. And finally, by the time you get to the Qajar period, it's literally a skin. It is a surface of decorative art, and it's a tile. It's not even brick anymore. And so as you go through the images of Islamic architecture, and you recognize that critical to its cultural underpinnings is precisely the lack of figure and iconography, that it does with calligraphy and with geometry what in the West is done with the body and its symbolism. That all here is repressed within the context of the brick as a medium through which the architecture is allowed to speak somehow. So, bringing this all to a more contemporary setting of the 20th century, then you begin to appreciate the two modalities in which ideas about figuration and the historical impulse get to take shape. In one instance, on the left, you appreciate the way in which the brick as a medium is negated insofar as it's sculpted, and the image of the figure is extraneous to the brick itself. And on the right, you appreciate that a certain figure may emerge from the pixels, if you like, from the very module of the brick itself. And so this shows you the history that we brought to the idea, not of the running bond, nor of the Flemish bond, but the idea that we're not looking at the brick anymore, but rather the space between the brick, to understand that the mortar between all of those bricks, from the Seljuk period to the Safavi period, are a vocal part of being able to expand and contract as part of its ordering system to denote something. And therefore, the wall in Venezuela, which has absolutely nothing to do with Islamic architecture, has all to do with a layering of traditions that evolve separately sometimes. And this maybe is an important moment to bring in, the theoretical differences between synchronic and diachronic history. In one instance, as you're looking at the social, the political, and the economic circumstances under which something is given shape, what architects are also able to do is to cross-laminate and stack histories that are not actually related to each other, but that are learning from each other in a very particular medium. And then that, I believe you were getting to that focused history in a different way, the way that you can isolate, let's say, the history of brick. And this speaks to that in a certain sense. The variable bond is part of that history, and equally so, the discovery, albeit late on my part, in my trips to Rome in 1983, that, well, the brick is not even structural after all of that. The brick is merely a casing for the concrete. Very modern, if you like. In that sense, the concrete has structural mass to it. It has no ductility, as it were, but it has a kind of environmental presence, as the thick walls are able to bear energy. It is for this reason that the translation of that brick structure into the Tongxian project in China is all the more poignant, because the brick is actually formwork for the ductility of the steel that is embedded within the concrete, and becomes a formwork that is no longer thrown away. Drawing from the economies of the brick trade in China, we knew that it could be built incredibly cheaply. But in fact, because of the seismic pressures of Beijing, you could not build in the old brick technique. So this is a hybridization of historic techniques in combination with modern codes, and bringing it to the absurd conditions whereby the brick is literally the formwork for the soffit underneath. Now, the figuration aspect of this takes you more towards the land of myth, or history as myth. And this is where an element of allegory, of symbolism, and of representation comes into play. One cannot deny at the end that even those organizations which seem to be straight have a slant to them. And so, recognizing that, we also understand how a particular medium may bring a completely different form to that same curtain because the form emerges from deep within the grains of a particular material logic. In this case, the corrugated copper that is the cladding of this house is able to unroll, as it were, to give space to the awning of the skin and establish a figurative relationship with the brick building, albeit fundamentally different in enterprise. There is something to be said about the Islamic traditions and their commitment to part-to-whole relationships, and that's maybe something that, if it didn't come through my religion, because I'm not a Muslim, it came through the pores of a cultural circumstance. And when I was faced with a project, again, a student project in Boston, I came to discover a strange coincidence. That much like Rome, Boston used to be the city of 7 hills. Except in Boston's case, a good many of those hills were cut down to make for the landfill of the Back Bay and the South End. And during my stay in Rome last year, I was lucky enough to get this view on one of those hills in the Gianicolo, and an understanding how the prospect brings a different kind of understanding of the history of that city. Now these are all related because from them I'm building a logic. During this historical stay some 30 years ago, I also went to Florence, and impressed by the marketplace and the way in which this monolithic table-like structure is the mechanism for furnishings underneath, tables, awnings that serve the immediacy of quotidian life and exchange. And how that connection to the table is latent and yet not expressed. I was also impressed by the way in which one's interpretive faculties can bring different readings, and how the symbol of Rome, in fact, is the symbol of the she-wolf and Romulus and Remus, and how they come into conversation, and how that curious and empathetic narrative provides for such a strong symbol for a city. And how these things can work together as images. So this project here, curiously, at the intersection of Massachusetts Avenue and Washington Street, is really reconstructing the height of that hill where Boston used to be, where it used to have at its neck a hill, that is really a narrative about the table and the way in which one table is nested with another, a pergola, underneath which are a series of infant tables that happen to be flush with the sidewalk. A kind of excavation of that sidewalk provides for the infrastructure of market space, ping pong tables, but essentially establishes a part-to-whole relationship between the unit of construction as a table and the edifice as a whole. Now, what produces the unique and curious skin condition that describes the surface of that table leads back to an embedded or encrypted logic of the staircase and its landings, which participate in the manifestation of its legibility. I'm not trying to give you a narrative of reason. I'm simply trying to immerse you in the cloud of associative madness that can come to bear on somebody as you're thinking in this modality. Now, just to end with, to end with something that Michael introduced this talk with, we were also asked to examine the Poggio Fanales, a piece of earth, another hill, lodged between the historic and modern city of Caltagirone, whose origins come from Qal'at Arjarar, which is the castle of the one-eyed monster. Essentially, it goes back to the myth of the battles, back to Homer and the myths of the battles in Sicily, and the protectorate of this one small town was Caltagirone, and the person who protected it from all of the different people. But nobody knew where he lay. And as you look at the city, you begin to appreciate the way in which, at the nexus of the old and the new city, there is a chunk of earth, the Poggio Fanales, which can be framed as part of the modern grid and contained. And as part of that myth goes, is that part of the retaining wall still rests there. And some people have thought that it is the place within which he lays rest. And so there's a whole narrative about the figure of this monster and the different access points that you come up to in engaging it. And embedded in that crust, there is a cranium, there is the arms, there's the ear, there's the foot, and they give body to the nature of this beast. But I'm only interested in one here. And it goes back to the ways in which we establish a dialogue with history, in this case, an ingrained Roman history that sees as its vocation the presence of the axiality of the arch, the stability of the arch as a structure, and the clarity with which it can be understood. Only, of course, to recognize that vision is a great part of this. And as vision is, in a way, displaced for the acoustic function of that ear, you begin to understand the anamorphic function of that arch as it acquires different senses being embedded in it. And in fact, this was supposed to be an entry that gets you into the cranium where a concert hall would be. Connecting us to the Orecchio di Dionysius, which is not too far away, one of those kinds of experiences I had on the trips to Italy, where a natural and geological element within the landscape of Sicily gives shape to an important part of its cultural imaginary. Now, bringing us back to the prospect of anamorphosis, what intrigues me about it is not the technical feat, because once you've understood that, it is something that is readily done. It's mechanical, and almost anybody can do it. But insofar as it is able to construct perception, it is also able to challenge it, to critique it. And in the context in which we were operating, we were very much interested in the ability of something to be able to make references that are external to itself and to challenge, if you like, the traditions from which architecture emerges. The story behind fabrications is actually not in the first instance architectural, but rather theoretical. Now, Terry Riley had asked us to not do drawings, not do models, but do a fragment of architecture that is wholly situated within the discourse of art of the museum, but that is speaking to contractors. He talked about tolerance, he talked about what is plumb, what is level, and what is right. And those were all new terms to me, because in architecture school we don't necessarily delve in those issues. But we drew something that spoke to the flatness of the modern canvas. And we wanted to create a painting as flat as can be, that was perfectly plumb, perfectly level, perfectly right, and potentially something that could achieve a tolerance of less than 1/4 of an inch over the length of 50 feet. Now that flat canvas is, in fact, what produced the kind of architectural inroads into developing, this is with Milgo Bufkin right down the street, the idea of the stitch seam and the folded surface, whereby a single surface of a sheet of steel may yield structural properties as it is wrapped around jigs over 50 feet with myriads of customized sheets within the context of a spatial construct that is anything but flat. And in a way undoing that anamorphic moment at the moment of entry, at once in dialogue with the institution of art and at the other, a kind of challenge to the construction industry and its reliance on techniques of conception from plan to section and construction techniques that require plumb bobs in the first place to achieve something that is built through jigs. I just want to end with one image here of my thesis project, which also describes the mindset from which we emerged. And it was the beginning of the croissant in the United States. For those of us who, came from other parts of the world, and understanding that this is something that can be sold or bought at Burger King or McDonald's, something we take for granted today, was a real oddity, because we had a very stable notion of what a croissant is, or what a ham sandwich might be, but we relished in the idea that we are a manifestation of that cultural condition. And during the time of the revolution, in fact, we didn't fit, and probably still don't. We weren't Americans, we weren't Iranians, and we had to make something of the contradictions of this cultural condition. And so that thesis was, in fact, a collision between the spatial, cultural, and formal problematics that were born out of these, not forms and not histories, but the rituals that give presence to those forms and rituals.
If we're going to have some sandwiches before studio, we have like a half hour or more. Is there something that the two of you would like to start with, or should we open it up?
I just am very happy. I just feel what's very lovely about this presentation is the way in which you folded history as a practice of living in the present into design as a practice of designing in the present, and with little history, but a lot of understanding, memory, tactility, listening carefully and looking carefully. The questions that divide, how do you use history, become really moot.
But that's why I called it the predicaments of history,
Right.
because in the context of a design studio, there are, let's say, so many ways in which one can engage the prospect of history.
Yeah.
And it's wholly different than the scholarship that goes with history. And so how it's managed, without guilt, that is, putting the issue of guilt aside and putting the issue of alibis, crutches, and justifications aside, the ways in which one learns from certain episodes in history as a point of departure, as a point of inflection or interpretation, is something that if we don't do explicitly, the chances are we're doing it ideologically, because there's inherited assumptions that are somehow fed to us by our teachers that we take as truths, which are completely parts of other fabrications of other histories.
Right.
So, what this is meant to show is the way in which those histories take on a meta narrative on their own, and in turn need to be overthrown once again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was struck. Thank you for the history, the story history of your history, and I was struck by how classical is the trajectory you showed us. I mean, really, you took us through a grand tour, even geographically, through Rome, Sicily, even the Middle East. And so in that sense, I mean, it doesn't matter, I think, if it's real or constructed. I mean, I think the narrative was very interesting. And I'm wondering about the moment, and even culminating in the vision and the anamorphosis. And I'm wondering, in the moment of jump that you made from the orecchio and the anamorphosis, and then this blue artifact with the request of Terry Riley not to use drawing, not to use models. Is it possible, really, like, to not use models and to not use drawings and to still...
I'm sorry, I should have clarified. We obviously had to do drawings, and we obviously did build models. He refused to present them. He wanted the exhibition called Fabrications to be dedicated wholly to architectural fragments in the way that you would see in Beaux-Arts schools, where fragments of Roman edifices would be sort of lumped into the building here and there. And he wanted this not to be about representation as such, or mock-ups, but really the full-scale artifact. So,
okay. But my question was really if it would have been possible to relate and learn from that history that you presented, if you remove actually all those modes of representation, and that you jump to the fabrication, and if you jump to sort of exaggerating the request of Terry Riley, of removing all the artifacts that actually were used to represent all the grand tour that actually you yourself presented.
look,
So in that sense, the role of history, is it possible to carry it through?
Is it necessary?
That's another question.
Probably not. But in this instance, I think there is an importance in the evident divorce between what architecture does visually versus what our architecture does structurally. And to me, the presence of optics, even in the antithesis of a Greek column, is a fascinating impulse that so many people would somehow sit around a desk or a construction site and say, no, this is wrong. This column should bulge. Now please chip away a little bit more at the base. The idea of the narrative that led to the bulge of an antithesis is something that, for me, is a very interesting one in the context of the history of tectonics, where the truth lays not in the actuality of construction, but in somewhere in the slippages between actuality and the optical. And so,
and the technical.
And the technical, yeah.
The easy repetition of columns in mass production from the 18th century on, right, really does give the lie to the incredible artistry or of the technical artistry of making a column drum. Making the column drum with very primitive tools in stone, lifting it, centering it, making each one slightly different but absolutely fit with the one on top. It's the most extraordinary. In fact, they now think that that the invention of mathematics by Anaximander and Thales was stimulated by their observation of the mason's tools, and that constructed with such perfection the column drop. And it's a very interesting reversal of the normal history. Mathematics, in fact, did not come before practice. Practice made mathematics.
But I mean, I guess I like your question because on the one hand, it reveals somewhat the arbitrariness of how we build narratives in order to get at some place, and at some point you can actually divorce yourself from the source. But also, it's a reminder of how thick and pungent culture is, that it produces such directions in people's work, and that you can see that overlay in sometimes different cultures, in different centuries, and in different interpretations of common phenomena.
But is that history? I mean, I like what you presented. I'm sorry, Tony, I missed your presentation, so I'm not going to speak too much because I don't know the first half by the historian, actually. So I'm going to base on what you're saying and what Tamar just mentioned, and what Tony said about this parkour through, places and memories and all that. And architects always use references, right? I mean, all the time. As do historians, by the way. I mean, if you're charting and you like this and you like that, and you make a sketch or make a note or whatever. We all do that. That's our engagement as subjects, as psychological subjects that perceive, that create, that engage with the world around us, with all what it has to offer us, in whichever modes it is, whether it's in stone or in text or in images or whatever it is. Now, that's one mode of operation, which can engage your unconscious, fosters your creativity and all that. Now, history, that's a whole other thing. History is a discipline. And as such, even taken with different approaches, which I'm going to talk about here, we have a historian himself, but there are certainly different approaches to how you understand history has been done. There have been, et cetera, whether you jump periods or whichever the connections may be. But there are concepts there that organize this historical material or historiographical material, whether it is written on the walls or on the books. So even if you're parkour through Rome or whatever, or when you take these, I'm thinking about the Corbusier. I mean, we always criticize that he didn't use history, but it was interesting because he was using both. He was using the reference, but using historically as a reference to some concepts, which had to do with proportions, etc., etc.
This whole session started with a question about the relationship between history, and history as brought into design. And that was part of our
But I'm saying the particular mode in which it is brought, that was where I was getting, that the particular mode, and it's more of a question for you guys, because you seem to flow through your creative in a long period of time. Obviously you went through when you were a student and now and so on and so forth. But I think the mode of operation as a referential object that has historical bearing, like if you go to Rome, certainly you can't escape history, but then it's a history of that city, right? And then there are pieces that resonate with you or they come up or not. And then there's something else, stereotypy, or there's whatever it is, there are all kinds of things. Now that seems like a mode of operation that even if you use history as a reference, which is also done by architects, more organized, less organized, etc., as everybody's always going back to look at stuff, right? We all do that all the time, right? We tell students, go look at this, go look at that, go look at that, whichever period it may be, it doesn't matter, right? So I'm saying it's a very different mode of operation, right? And so how is it historical? Then my question is, how is that the use of history is not the same as the use of history as you look for specific issues, specific reference in different periods, wherever they may be, that you jump period, you jump architects, you go to this, you go to that, one day you like this one, next day you recall something else.
This is why I cite the problematic relationship between synchronic and diachronic histories. The idea that on one level there are historical narratives that establish deep-seated relationships between social, economic, cultural phenomena that are not evident to the eye, but that require different kind of historiographic work to understand, versus the other kind where we can look at history as a kind of repository of forms and spaces and artifacts that we can freely navigate through without the kind of repercussions of having to necessarily unearth the underpinnings of how they came to bear on some phenomena or another. Now, and I'm not saying this uncritically, I'm saying that is the problem, in fact. And so what I've tried to also show here are slightly different modes of activity, particularly when you look at the discovery on the Seljuks and the Safavids and the Qajars, because to my Western eye, looking back on, with innocence to an Iranian history or an Islamic history, they're all the same. They all appear to be, it's flat. As a history, it was flat. And to discover that, the ways in which culture operates and the rituals in relationship it operates may look the same, but they're fundamentally different, is an important discovery. And maybe there's a different historian out there who can tell the full story. There's actually a very good Italian historian who is a scholar of Islamic architecture.
Well, following up just a little bit on Diana's question, I'd like to hear you both comment on something that you brought up in the start of your presentation, Nader, that when you were in school, you were at the tail end of one relationship to history and the start of what one could then historically call a move to theory. And I know, Tony, you just published something recently in eFlux about this history to theory, theories of history, histories of theory issue. And I think that this
which I've lived long enough to become the historian.
But I think this move has everything to do with kind of some of the questions we're asking today. And a number of younger architects in their re-engagement of history are coming at it post this theoretical turn that happened in the not so distant past.
Yeah, and the big struggle of someone like Manfredo was to adjudicate between those what he called instruments of criticism that would establish more concretely and more firmly the relationship of evidence to interpretation as history, and those which were immediately prone to construct a history as a project for architecture, right? Which was very much, our discussions were always to do with the fact that Foucault, and especially the Foucault as it developed in Paris with the Bruno Fortier group, who were researching institutional forms after the birth of the clinic, after the history of madness, and so on, became a kind of watchword for immersing oneself into the typologies of institutions without understanding Foucault's actual message, which was the discursive nature of institutions in relationship to ideology, law, and so on. Those kinds of questions which preoccupy. If you read Tafuri's prefaces, from the first preface to his book on Quaroni to the last preface to his book on research in the Renaissance, there are a series of grappling with the predicaments, not just of history, but the predicaments of theory and the predicaments of ideology in history, of history, and about and within history. And I find those very salutary, and that's what the piece was about, actually.
even the quote that you brought up that distinguishes between the monumental method, the antiquarian, and the critical.
That's Nietzsche, yes. Yeah.
Exposes the ideological nature of how the same artifact may, or the same geography may be
Right.
looked at with three very different eyes
Yeah.
and telling a completely different story.
Yeah.
Because when I see that Professor Vidler presented the book that Peter Eisenman wrote for his PhD, I remember I read that Eisenman actually had the sort of within the correspondence, he argued with Colin Rowe about the title of the PhD essay. Rowe said that, why don't you put the essay's title as the formal basis of architecture, why you have to add the word modern? Is it something applied only to modern architecture, or is it something that's universally within the architectural discipline? And this brings me one question, because there's this guy called Clement Greenberg that says,
This guy.
basically expresses,
Yeah, this guy.
sorry,
Yeah.
sorry that.
Yeah.
So he says that the modernization of architecture is defined by its ability to critique itself. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Eisenman was trying to say that the act of critiquing architecture in the past is actually an act of modernization. So I don't know if you agree with this idea that self-criticism defines modernism, or the history after modernism, or is it some sort of lineage that already existed in the past but it's brought up in the table explicitly after the technological advances that happened after the museum.
Okay, I think here there has to be a distinction between two very different words, modern and modernism. Modern is always been used since Rome to deal with something that is now as opposed to then. The ancients and the moderns were, always disputed right through all rhetorical processes from Cicero all the way through to the present. So the notion of the modern movement, right? As somebody said, there was no modern movement outside bowel movements, right? Because nobody talks about the modern movement, right? No architect talks about the modern movement. Only historians talk about the modern movement, right? So Corbusier calls about esprit moderne, the modern spirit, right? Mies didn't say a thing, right? Alto didn't say a thing. So they're all supposed to be the modern movement, categorized by Pevsner as something that he wants to give movement to as a good Hegelian, ending in Gropius, right? The most powerful member of the modern movement. Everybody's dropped off, but Gropius stands at the end. So modern in that respect, right? When Peter is using the word modern, it's very different from when Clement Greenberg is using the word modernism. Clement Greenberg, as many have said, invented modernism as a particular way of producing the relationship of pigment to a flat surface. Right? For him, modernism was from Manet through to Pollock. Right? And there were criteria for modernism that he established. Right? Fred Jameson gave a wonderful lecture once where he actually demonstrated exactly the process by which Greenberg invented the notion of modernism. Right? Modernismo, right? That other word in Spanish refers to in the area of the the early 20th century. It refers to Art Nouveau. So
but embedded in his question is another idea about Greenberg where he's talking about this moment of self-reflection, which is critical by nature.
Right.
And whether that, and I may be miswording what you're asking, is a 20th century phenomena, or actually this idea of self-reflection is something that all of architectural history can be characterized by in the overturning of traditions that reflect back onto the discipline itself.
That's, if you read Tafuri's, one of his great books that he completely refuted, but which I think is one of his finest works, his book on mannerism.
Yeah.
He goes through writing after writing after writing after writing, talking about the way in which these authors, the authors, the architect authors of mannerism,
Yeah.
are in fact demolishing the critical premises of the previous generation in a very, very rigorous way. Right? And yes, I think you're right. The criticism is always that self-reflection on the past. I mean, in a sense, history cannot be critical. It cannot not be critical by inference, right? Because you are, in fact, constructing a reality that never existed, a reality that is totally intellectual. Periodization is intellectual. Styles are intellectual. The only thing that's
But
not
you're using critical
intellectual-
different than Nietzsche used it.
Yes,
Because he also used the antiquarian and the monumental,
right.
which are ideologically would suggest a completely different motivation in the political environment in which we're living in today.
Yes, yes.
Imagine that, right?
Yes, absolutely. Well, what he is saying, of course, is that what happens when one or other of those three moments of living history, living in history, if you totally accentuate the antiquarian, there are those people who live totally for and in the past and can't act in the present.
Yeah.
If you are monumentalizing past history, you're saying, make architecture great again.
Yes.
And you're trying to reconstruct the past as a banner for your power in the present, right? If you're totally critical, there's nothing left but a pile of ruins that you have demolished over and over and over again. Which is why he's talking about the triad of this, which is a kind of strange Nietzschean non-dialectical triad. It's a continuous dialectic between two, and the third one completely messing up the dialectic and not becoming the resolution of the dialectic, which is his attack on Hegel.
Can I offer an answer to his question about Peter Eisenman and Colin Rowe?
Absolutely.
I think that, which was your question, right? The correspondence between Peter Eisenman and Colin Rowe regarding Peter Eisenman's PhD thesis. Well, it's perfect because Colin Rowe is giving him a historian's title, and Peter couldn't care less. He's using history. All he wants is he's always used theory as a way to inspire him to do architecture.
Yeah.
There's no other, in my opinion, Peter Eisenman, although he's known as a super theoretician, he really is not a theoretician in the real sense of the word, because he wants an answer before even he has a question.
Yeah.
He's looking for a given answer. And he has a goal there. In real theory, you have a question, and then God knows where to take you. It may take you where you didn't want to go, or where you didn't know you would get. Right? So I would say that, and these is people
No,
have
you're
different
right.
ways of operating and creating. So
Yeah.
that's Eisenman's way.
Yeah.
Doesn't take his brilliance and all the rest, and then he's very good when he's doing analysis of other buildings or architects, but when he does it in his own stuff. So when he says modern, it's an ideological move which says, I'm using Palladio only to generate a set of formal rules and operations that I'm going to use to generate my stuff. And when Colin Rowe is looking at the cover, and then he takes, and there's a long history of that you and Tony know better than I do, then that's a historian speaking. That's Colin Rowe. And he says, a form, not modern. He's not qualifying that ideologically what it's going to be. He's saying these are formal operations. And then it's set within a historical moment, context, etc., etc. Is that?
Yeah, for rightly or wrongly. But I think the other thing which is very interesting in that transition, during the year that he was writing a thesis, he also went in for the competition for the Boston City Hall, right? During the 2 years that he was teaching at Cambridge, he was also teaching us how to draw like Paul Rudolph, right?
It
Very,
looks like
very
Paul Rudolph. It looks
thin
like Paul Rudolph,
lines, hatched, right? His project for Boston City Hall was totally brutalist. I mean, it was the most perfect brutalist solution, even more brutalist and more perfect than the one that won, right? Very elegant. I built the model, so I should know, right? So at that point, he is searching for a way out of the brutalist aesthetic, not ethic, right? And at the same time as he's understanding that brutalism in its formal structure was the next step from, say, Villa Savoye in its pure structure. It was the next step in terms of messing things up, but still dealing with the combination of abstract forms, right? So abstraction and form. So how do you get out of that? You get out of it by reading Paul Klee. You get out of it by reading Moholy-Nagy. You look at the footnotes in the thesis. They are all there, the ones that animate and deconstruct the purity of the pure forms that Corbusier was putting forward as resolution, right? At which point he involves himself, taking from Vikova, the notion of the diagram, right? The diagrammatic architecture, which is the abstraction of form, right? And he takes his Corbusier forms and he slices them and dices them like so many, cakes at a wedding party, right? And then adds that movement, right, which is the movement I described through the Armée du Salut, that whole movement pattern through those circles and squares into the thing. Movement plus the ability of a form, a three-dimensional form, to carry within itself its own dynamics, right? That's Paul Klee. The diagonal is the dynamic of the cube, the diagonal, and so that sets up a motion. Then motion into or motion out of set up a series of reverberations, like kind of almost sonic boom through the building. At that point, and Diana's absolutely right, he is testing out the formulation that is going to come to fruition in the house 1 to 11, where you start with the cube and you start slicing, and you're adopting a kind of pseudo structuralist theory of grammar and stuff
it was
like that.
Chomsky.
The Chomskyan. But that's just to make it seem like relevant. In fact, he's doing no more nor less than any Mannerist architect was doing with Colin Rose's facades, right? But Colin gave him the idea. Colin hated the systematization of the formal stuff, right? He really hated it because Colin always wanted it to be open. He wanted every facade to give another message every time he looked at it, right? Every plan to give another message, right? Whereas Peter wanted it to be his next design. Diana's totally right.
There's also, if I can add just a footnote to that one, I think there was also the interest in Eisenman to bring toward the modern movement, inside of the reading of the modern movement, that at the time had this kind of myth of being objective, deductive, structural, program, and so on, an entire set of questions that seemed to be applicable only to a sort of classical architecture, meaning the idea of a syntax or the grammar or the relation between parts and so on. And so in a sense bring what you were talking before, this other kind of modern figure into a reasoning that was different from the myth of the modern movement. And also to all the different rivulets of the different architecture.
It's interesting because his first publication of that idea, which was in Architectural Design in 1953, came at almost the same time as two other publications, right, about modernism and the reform or the reformulation. One was the publication of Summerson in 1957 on the idea of the program in modern architecture. And the other was Bannon's stocktaking in 1960, which was to do with the new technological. In other words, architecture, right, which in modernism, in its version of modernity, the kind of Corbusian/Miesian version of modernity, had somehow pretended to solve the relationship between technology, form, and program, right? Had actually not solved it, to the point where these three strands, architectural form, architectural technology, and architectural program now had their own autonomy, ready to be taken up by Chris Alexander in computerism and programming, right? Ready to be taken up by Archigram through Centre Pompidou in technology, and ready to be taken up by Peter in terms of form. So that trio was we called them the terrible trio in London, right? Summerson, the classical historian, talking about programming. Banham, the aircraft fitter, talking about technology. And Peter, the filmmaker, talking about form. Should we eat?
Can I slip in one more question maybe? And that's just, so I think thank you both for doing this, and for, as deans and as leaders of schools, for doing this. And I couldn't tell if latent in the argument was the suggestion that, I'm not sure, Nader, from your point of view, you took history really as an experiential, Rome through Italy, very light, not so much on readings, theorizing or historicizing, but looking for the forms and some of the narratives behind the forms. Tony, you looked at, a lineage of the great historians of the second half of the 20th century. Are you saying that these can kind of happen and should happen in a design school in a way that's not so formal, or a word that we're using a lot right now, silo? They're not in silos, independent silos, but actually need to bring a generosity and yet a rigor to each other?
Absolutely, and I think that that a design school that does not situate the objects of its practice in capitalism, in exploitation, in richness and poorness, in social questions, in economic questions, and a design school that doesn't situate the objects of its practice in the study of how those objects came into being is encouraging blindness and deafness and dumbness on the part of its architects. But a design school that separates that out from the sensibility of experience in relationship to space and form and technology and technique, and those experiences, such as described by Nader in terms of brick bonding, right, is also you have to have both, and they have to talk to each other.
If I had to respond to it, I would say that because I did actually go to the history and theory program in the AA in a much beleaguered way, but I'm also aware of the real challenges of history being taught in design schools. And often, even if not in reductive ways, one's aptitude at a certain moment in time in the context of a design studio might be limited and cannot get into the depths of what a historical research requires, which sets you up in this kind of, with the vulnerability of having to do something with a certain level of innocence and ignorance.
Yeah.
And what I was presenting to you was that moment of innocence. What I also was trying to show or kind of reveal is that despite that innocence, the prospect that the artifacts that surround us, from this thing here to this thing here, that they're laden with multiple associations and an intertextuality that comes from many cultures and many sources, reveals something about the historical nature of how things emerge nonetheless. And maybe part of our task as designers is to relieve ourselves of the guilt of the rational or the scholarly work and just do things, but remind ourselves that after it's done, there is another work of scholarship that can be done that revisits that work in the context of a much richer history from which issues of labor, of race, of ideology are all there, but not evident to your eye at the time that you're producing them. So
So it's also, when you say histories of architecture, histories of architecture have always been from Vitruvius on, right? But what is architecture, right? For Vitruvius, it was siege engines, it was water clocks, it was ditches, dikes, aqueducts. It was the whole thing, right? For art historians in the late 19th century, it was Alberti to Bramante, right? And then pushed a little bit further into the Baroque in the mid-1920s, right? So the history of architecture has always been deeply compromised by what is architecture in the general culture. When Pevsner wrote his history of European architecture in 1937 to 1938, the first sentence is, a bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture, right? Architecture was only allowed into his book if it raised the spirit of all that stuff, right? Raised the spirit of mankind, gave you an extraordinary experience of uplift, right? So this kind of history has continuously been revised, right? Post-colonial history, gender-based history, and a whole range of theoretical questions opening up history to those questions, which is why theory is important for history and why it's also dangerous.
If there's one thing I like about the predicament, it's that with all of the scholarship in history that can be done, the idea that an innocent piece of architecture can be in conversation with other pieces of architecture before and after them.
Yeah.
And that somehow this, the anachronism that is the act of design is always somehow has the potential to speak outside of the literary format. That spaces and forms are pregnant with their own form of scholarship, whether you recognize it or not.
Is there gentlemen? We close, or can I?
We gotta eat a sandwich or two.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, yeah.
Say it out loud.